for my #1 tip for this, which I cannot believe that I haven't used before. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining me again. Today I'm going to be photographing some birds in flight again, and I'm going to go over my settings on my EM1X. So a lot of the settings will be the same for the EM1 series, but there's a couple of things I think you may not be able to set. But stick around, you might get something out of this. I'm really excited about this one feature that I can't believe that I haven't used until now. It's just not really been on my radar. I know it's not the bird auto tracking, but stay tuned and we'll go over that as well. Now, if you don't want to stick around for the whole video, you can, I'll put the chapter links at the bottom, so you can kind of just jump to the ones that interest you. Hopefully I will be taking some photos of the birds here as well. I've got all my settings ready to go, so if anything looks like it's going to fly by, I'll stop for some photos. There doesn't seem to be anything going on here right now, so let's dive into the menu and we'll go over the settings that are kind of deep into the menu system first. And a lot of these I will use default anyway, so they're just always on. So I'll go over them now just in case you have something different. And just so you know, this isn't like the ultimate guide or anything like that. This isn't a must for how to photograph birds in flight. I'm just going over what's been working for me. And you know, there's definitely been some changes on the way. I've tried out things over long periods of time, and then all of a sudden, you know, figured out something new that works, and I've changed it to that. So let's just dive into this. And for this, we'll go into the cog on the menu system and into A1. So the A is all about focus. We'll go down to AF scanner first. I just always have that on mode 3, and that just means that it's going to continuously scan if it doesn't have focus on something. The second one here has to do with the continuous autofocus sensitivity. I'm usually in continuous autofocus, but every now and then I add on the tracking as well. But for the sensitivity, my default is +2. And especially when I'm in a situation like this where there is a chance that the birds might actually fly towards me. And +2 just means that it's going to be very sensitive. So as the bird is approaching me fast, it's going to have the most opportunity to, you know, keep updating the focus so that I get the best focus as it's approaching me. So that's always at +2 for me, except for when sometimes, actually I'll show you a little footage of this. I was sitting on the other side here, more towards evening, so I had the sun on the other side. So I just wanted to show you guys a setup where I have right here, you can see here, but I got some little branches and things like that that's sticking out here, or even going into me here. And this is where I would set sensitivity down to -2. And that means that if I'm tracking a bird, I'm following it in flight, and these branches here get in front of my view, then ideally it doesn't catch it. If it's a -2, it obviously depends how slow you go. You know, if you pan really slowly and it has enough time, it will catch that branch eventually. But putting it at -2 gives you the most amount of chance that it's kind of sticky. It sticks to the bird instead of catching really quickly other obstacles that are in the way. So sitting in a place like this where there are obstacles in between me and the birds in flight, then that's where I'm going to go to -2. Pretty much all other times I will go to +2 because I want it to be sensitive, especially if there's a chance that the bird is going to fly towards me, because I want that autofocus to keep updating really quickly so that I get focus on the bird as it's approaching me. For the next two settings, we have on the menu, we go down on the A1 menu and we get to continuous autofocus center start. So if it's going to take priority in the middle when you start focusing, and the next one is kind of similar if it's going to prioritize the center point. And you can go in here and you can tick the boxes for all the different ways you can configure your focus points. So for both of these, I will only tick the box that has 1 in the middle and 4 on the outside. That's the only time I want to prioritize the middle, because when I choose other things like a grid or something like that, I use the 5x5 focus point grid a lot of the time, but when I use that, I don't want to prioritize the middle. I want it to focus equally over the whole 5x5. That's why I'm using it. So the only box that I will tick is with 5 points and emphasis in the middle one. Okay, so let's dive into A2. For the mode settings that we just talked about, the different focus points, I like to keep that quite simple so that when I'm in the field and I want to change my focus points, I don't want to have too many to choose between. And you can go in here on A2 and you can choose the mode settings. You can choose how many you want available to you. So I actually only have 3 ticked here, but there's also a default that you have to have picked. So I only have one single in the middle. I have the 5 points, which is now going to have emphasis on the middle one. And then I have a 5x5 grid. And that's it. Because that means that I can cycle through really quickly when I want to change one of those. For the AF area pointer, this is really specific to birds in flight, but I quite like to have that on 2. It means that when I acquire focus, a green kind of square comes over where the focus point is. Now, if you have it on 1, that green square will just disappear. But if you have it on 2, it'll just continuously be there, and it'll just show me that I still have focus or where my focus point is. So I really like to have that available to me. So next one, we'll dive into A3. And obviously here, I will keep the tracking subject on the bird. I don't always use the tracking. In fact, I'm using it less and less, but we'll go over that in a little bit. But I keep it always on bird because that's what I'm going to be photographing. So one more thing in the menu system that I want to go over, and that is C1, and it is continuous autofocus release priority. I'm always, like I said, I'm always in continuous autofocus. I never actually use a single autofocus point because I'm using back button focus. So I have a video on back button focus. You're going to check that out, but there are a lot of benefits of photographing with back button focus. Anyways, for the continuous autofocus release priority, I turn that off. That just means that I won't waste loads of frames by taking shots when I'm not in focus. It's not 100%, and I get shots that are out of focus, but it will stop you from just firing away when you're definitely not in focus. Okay, so that's most of the kind of behind the scenes or deep in the menu system changes that I make. Or that I have made, and they're always my default now. I hardly ever change it for other types of photography. Now then, let's go back out to the Super Control panel, and we'll talk about more of the common settings for what I use. For the shooting mode, I like to have a low sequential, and I always use electronic shutter so that I never have a sound on when I'm actually pressing the shutter button. And that just really helps, whenever I'm photographing wildlife, and the wildlife never even know that I'm there sometimes because it's not making a sound. So that's always on the electronic shutter for me. Now, when it comes to frames per second, you can set that in the menu system, but I keep mine to default of 9 frames per second. Now, this might be a little bit slow for some people, but because I don't like to change my settings a lot of the time, I like to keep that mode on all the time. And 9 frames per second just means that if I'm really careful, I can just about, squeeze the trigger very gently and I can take 1 frame. And that just really helps me. It means that I'll never have to, waste frames if I just want to take 1 shot or anything like that. So 9 frames per second is just that sweet spot for me. It might be different for you, but you just got to test it out and see. So when I'm doing kind of opportunistically flight shot like this, I just keep it as a default. But if I'm expecting a really good image or I have a very good situation, I will go in and change that, and I'll just bump it to the max, which is 18 frames per second. I don't use the high burst mode because then it won't continuously autofocus in between frames. Whatever you focus on first comes into focus and you start shooting, that's where the focus point is. So it can take 60 frames per second, but your focus point there stays the same. So I only use that for pro capture. And I will use pro capture sometimes for birds in flight. So I do have a video on how to set that up specifically for birds in flight, when I use the low pro capture and when I use high. So go check that out if you're interested. I'll put a link up here. I should say I'm in manual mode. If you don't like being in full manual mode, then I suggest shutter speed priority. It's going to be fine. I like manual mode because once you get used to it, you can quickly change the settings for the situation. The problem with semi-automatic modes like shutter speed priority is that if the surroundings, maybe the background changes from dark to bright, the camera's going to get fooled and you're going to get a highly varied exposure. If I have a white bird here, if you have a darker background, it could easily get overexposed because it's going to take into account the background a lot of the time. And then vice versa, on a bright background and a dark bird, it might underexpose. So if you're using shutter speed priority, really learn to use the exposure compensation. Now, I have my camera on the EM1X Setup, maybe quite weirdly for a lot of people, but I actually have my two dials priority on ISO and shutter speed. And that just helps me out change my exposure quicker. So usually the default for most people, or for most cameras, is you push a button and then you get access to the ISO. But I find it a lot faster in the field to change my exposure with direct access to ISO and shutter speed, because when I want to change my f-stop, it's a very conscious decision. I want to increase my depth of field for it to achieve more focus, so I don't mind pressing an extra button for changing my f-stop, because I do that less regularly than I change my ISO. I will change my exposure using my ISO more often. So hope that makes sense. Now, if you are curious about exactly how I lay out all my buttons and dials and everything on my Olympus, then I'll put a link and you can go to my website and I'll give you access to a video there. I'm not going to put it normally on, as I do normally on YouTube, because this is more specifically interested for people who are interested in how I set up all the settings for my EM1X and Olympus cameras. So I'll put a link below and you can check that out at my website if you are interested. And on there, I'll go through the entire way I've set up my EM1X for wildlife photography. So for birds in flight, as I said, I'm in full manual, and my usual default is starting with something like 1600th shutter speed, my lowest f-stop, which is f4 right now. At the moment I'm shooting with the 4150 2.8, but I have an extender 1.4 on it as well to give me a bit extra reach. At the moment, I'm also in f5.6, so when there's available light, I will put my f-stop up a little bit to increase the depth of field, and it makes it easier to capture birds in flight sharp. So if I have available light, I will bump up my f-stop a little bit. And that really helps, because very often I'll have like a group of birds or something that are flying together, and I want to at least try to get, all of them sharp. Ideally, that doesn't always work. You need quite a bit of light for that, quite a bit of depth of field, but it gives me more of a chance to capture them anyways, because when you're photographing birds in flight, it's very easy to catch focus on the wings or anything else, and the eye becomes out of focus. And as I said, for shutter speed, I like the default of 1600, but it all depends on what kind of birds you have. For small, fast birds, you want to be up at 3200th of a second or even faster. For larger raptor soaring, you might not even need more than 500th of a second. If you want more tips on photographing birds in flight, I have a video on that already, so go check that out if you want more tips on how to photograph birds in flight. Now, for my image stabilization for this, and my default setting for that is just image stabilization auto, and for birds in flight like this, I keep it on it. You could turn it off. You don't exactly need image stabilization for birds in flight, but I like to steady the aim because it gets a little bit shaky, especially if you have a very long focal length. So I quite like to have the image stabilization on, so it just helps me steady and it helps me compose the image. I don't mind keeping that on. When I want to change it up and take something different, like panning images, that's when I will go in and I will change it to vertical shake. So that's IS2 on this one. So that just means that my camera will only correct for up and down movements, but won't correct for the horizontal panning movement, because I want that blur in the background. But I did a video on this last week, so go check that out if you want some tips on how to take panning images of birds in flight. And I think it's a really fun way to photograph, because it just creates something very different and unique a lot of the time. So it's definitely worth exploring that. So go check that out. I'll put a link to it here. My default for the focus grid is a 5x5. Now, I mentioned last week in the video that I will use bird tracking quite a bit. Can be good sometimes. But this last week, I've experimented a lot more with photographing birds in flight, and I found that it just failed me more times than not. I got better results when I put on a 5x5 grid and I use continuous autofocus. Now, I actually used to use just one point in the middle or one surrounded by four. And I do think that sometimes you do need to have that as well, and that is when it gets really busy backgrounds and your camera's just going to keep chasing, it jumps from the background and forth. And in those situations, it's definitely worth the try the bird tracking, because I do sometimes find that that can be a good feature, but because it's let me down loads of times, I don't use it as my default, but I have a preset on it. And on the EM1X, you know, I have my preset just on the back here, so instantly it changes to that. Anyway, so 5x5 grid is now my default. If it gets busy, if I'm not successful with that, I'll change and I'll flick through the ones I have available to me, and I'll change it to either a single point in the middle or one surrounded by 4. And the way I have a quick change for that is pushing this joystick in and then dialing on the back. And that's, you know, so it can get a little bit tricky because it's very easy to actually, you know, to lean a little bit on the joystick and kind of go sideways and then it moves. But once you get the hang of it, holding that in and then dialing around is fairly easy, and it's really quickly. You know, you do it without moving around too much on your camera. Really quickly by just dialing in the back here and holding my thumb on that joystick. Now though, for my number one tip for this, which I cannot believe that I haven't used before, and I really should have known about this ages ago and taken more advantage of it. So on a lot of lenses, I don't have it on this lens, but I have it on my 300, there's an autofocus limiter. But I've always found it to be, you know, it's good, but for birds in flight, it doesn't quite work because there's one feature that it has missing and it's not customizable. But in the camera, we have an autofocus limiter range that you can set yourself. So I don't know if many people may know this, many people use it already probably, maybe I'm just a little bit slow to the game. This to me is the biggest game changer for photographing birds in flight on the Olympus system. So for me here, I go into, it is in the cog again, it is an A3 and it's AF limiter. So you go right again and then you go on. And now here you can set distance settings, and like the one you often get on your lens, there are actually 3 different settings you can have on that. Now for me, I like to keep it simple. I don't like to mess around with 3 different settings. I don't need that. I need one. And the one I need is, I want to be able to focus as close to me as possible. And then I just want to have a limit on the background. So for me here now, that just helps. I can set that background so that my camera won't be able to focus on the background because it's too far away. So what you set here depends on the day you're shooting. But you can do a little bit of experimentation before you actually start shooting, and you can figure out exactly how far away that background is, and you can set a distance that's before that, that's way before that. And what you can also do with this is that a lot of times, you know, you might be a little bit trigger happy and you take photos when the birds are actually flying far away, and they're never going to be any good anyways because they're going to be so tiny in the frame. So unless you have something else that really complements them, like some amazing mountains or great light or something like that, usually not great. So in these situations as well, a focus limiter can just help you save yourself those shots. So what I have is set up here for now, my background is quite far away, so I've set mine from 0 to 250. And that just means that my camera won't focus on anything that's further away than 250. Now, if you want close-ups of birds in flight, then you could go down to way closer than that. You could set it to 100, you could set it to 50 meters, you could set it to whatever you want. And that can really help if you have a busy background, but you know how far away that is, then you can set in a range there, so you're just not going to focus on the background. And that is really going to help out with acquiring focus on the bird and not for the focus to just go all over the place. So what I also want to do after I've done that is I go down to B1 into button function, and I assign one of my buttons to instantly to activate that autofocus limiter. That's why I like just have one limiter, because if not, you have to hold in that button and then dial in the specific one you need. But when you only have one of them, it's just a push of that button and that autofocus limiter is activated. So for me, I go into B1, button function, and I have it set up to my ISO here, because as I said, I don't use that button. Like I said, every now and then I will try bird tracking as well, because I do think there are times when that is superior, and it can give some good results. But a lot of time it does fail me, so my default is to not use it, and I'll experiment with it. If it works well for a situation, I'll leave it on. But if not, I won't use it. I'd love to hear how you guys are getting on with photographing birds in flight. Do you use bird tracking, and have you tried autofocus limiter and just you know, just make sure that you never focus on that background. Love to hear from you, and you know, go check out some of these other videos I have on photographing birds in flight. I'll put links in the description below, and if you're interested in how I set up my entire, you know, how I set up my Olympus, then, you know, follow the link to my website and you can get access to the video there. Thank you guys so much for watching. See you next week.